Hello everyone and welcome back to Alternative Apex. Today we're going to be doing something quite different to usual. I have simulated 10 full seasons of F1 22 to see what would happen. We'll be looking at what the driver transfers are, who the champions are, and what surprises are there along the way. Of course, I'm not going to say otherwise, but I highly recommend watching this all the way to the end because there are some big surprises all the way through to the final season of racing. I will try to keep the descriptions of each season relatively brief, as to not bore you, but also trying to keep a sufficient amount of detail as we look into each season. So now it's time to look at the very first season, 2022. 2022 is probably the season we all expect to be the most like real life, and probably the easiest to predict. Season 1 was dominated by Ferrari as the team took 19 wins out of a possible 22, with Charles Leclerc predictably being the stronger driver. As a result, Charles Leclerc won his first World Championship by 176 points and took 15 race wins across the season. He was slightly less successful in qualifying as he only took 7 pole positions, however this was still the most of any driver in 2022. Sainz had the second most with 6, and Hamilton picked up 3, however he was unable to convert any of them into a race win. Russell and Perez both took their maiden pole positions this year, and the former took his first career win in Singapore. Verstappen managed a couple of wins to be the best non-Ferrari driver in the championship, beating the likes of Russell and Hamilton. Now it's time to move on to 2023, with a minor regulation change threatening to mix up the playing field. Going into 2023, we got our first driver transfers, so let's start by going through them. The first domino to fall was a surprising retirement in the form of Valtteri Bottas. His position in Alfa Romeo was taken by 4-time champion Sebastian Vettel. He was then replaced at Aston Martin by Kevin Magnussen, who was in turn replaced by the 2021 F2 champion Oscar Piastri. But that wasn't the end of it, as Tsunoda was fired by AlphaTauri. Lance Stroll then moved over to the Red Bull Junior team, Alex Albon joined the all-new Aston Martin lineup partnering Magnussen, whilst Zhou Guanyu then moved over to Williams as multiple-time F2 race winner Robert Schwartzman completed the grid at Alfa Romeo. So, lots of driver transfers going into this season, but all of them are in the midfield, so they don't look like they'll have any immediate effect up front. However, the mix-up could have some effects in the future. There were some new regulations for 2023, and they did knock the reigning champions as Ferrari were unable to win the Constructors' Championship this year. Mercedes took the top spot by 60 points in the Constructors, but that would be their only title that they won in 2023. Charles Leclerc would win his second Drivers' Championship with 9 wins, beating his nearest rival George Russell by 50 points. Whilst he couldn't win the championship, it was still a big season for Russell, as he took 6 race wins and 8 pole positions, double the pole positions of the eventual champion Charles Leclerc that year. Lando Norris managed to take his first ever F1 win in the Italian Grand Prix, and showed it wasn't just a fluke as he won again in the Japanese Grand Prix, demonstrating the skills to be a potential champion if he had a more competitive car. Now it's time to move on to the third season, 2024. This time the driver market was slightly quieter. Vettel retired after just 1 year with Alfa Romeo, as he only managed 12th in the championship. He was replaced by Yuki Tsunoda as the young driver returned to Formula 1 a year after being fired by AlphaTauri. Another regulation change for this season meant that there was again the chance of a shake-up. The year started with 4 different winners in the first 4 races. Those were Hamilton, Alonso, Russell and Verstappen. Noticeably, Alonso got his first win in almost 11 years. There was one name that was surprisingly missing from that group of winners. That is of course Charles Leclerc, whose Ferrari team had dropped down the order as they made a mistake with the new regulations. However, he did manage to get 2 wins later in the season as they began to recover. Now back to the title fight. Alonso and Hamilton quickly dropped out of the fight as Verstappen and Russell became the 2 rivals for the title. George Russell managed to get 7 wins across the season, but it wasn't enough to beat Verstappen, who took 8 wins on his way to his first championship of this simulation, and the second of his career, which brings him level with Charles Leclerc. Mercedes took the team's championship as both of their drivers were consistent throughout the season, whilst Perez had some struggles, costing Red Bull crucial points. After 2024, we had a relatively large amount of driver transfers, which was all kicked off by Lewis Hamilton retiring at the age of 39. Over his career, he took 109 race wins and 112 pole positions, along with his 7 World Championships. Former Mercedes Junior driver Esteban Ocon replaced him at Mercedes, as his fellow Frenchman Pierre Gasly moved to the promising Alpine team. Tsunoda returned to AlphaTauri and wasn't the only driver going back to their 2020 team, as Zhou returned to Alfa Romeo. Ex-Red Bull and Williams Jr. Dan Ticktum would then take the open seat at Williams Racing. The strange career of Robert Schwartzman continued as he was once again replaced at Alfa Romeo, this time by Nicholas Latifi. The empty space at Williams was then taken up by Liam Lawson, which meant the Williams team were going to be going into 2025 with 2 Formula 1 rookies. which wouldn't do them much good as the F2 drivers seem to have a very low skill level on this game so far. Going into 2025, there was no regulation change, so you'd be forgiven for thinking that this year would be very similar to 2024. Whilst there were certainly some similarities, there was also quite a lot of differences, as the reigning Constructors' Champions Mercedes would go winless throughout the season and only managed to take 2 pole positions late in the year. Norris had a breakout season as he took 5 wins to McLaren, but there was nothing they could do to stop Verstappen winning another championship as the Dutchman took an impressive 16 race wins, Red Bull showing that last year wasn't just a fluke and that they would likely be a tough opponent to beat for future seasons. Only 3 drivers were able to get a win in 2025, as Pierre Gasly took his first win for Alpine, as the team again showed promise, and they were really becoming a true championship threat. Going into 2026, there were surprisingly 0 driver transfers to talk about, but a regulation change did pose a challenge to the teams. McLaren seemed to have got the regulations right when they got pole and 1 in Bahrain to start the season, but Verstappen fought back in the next race. Mercedes also rejoined the fight for wins as Russell took 6 wins in the final 9 races of the year, but it was too late to enter championship contention. McLaren achieved the Constructors' Championship, which would be their first since 1998 after a strong season for Norris, whilst Ricciardo was consistent enough to back up his teammate. However, Norris' 6 wins weren't enough to win the championship, as Verstappen once again won the title with 10 victories across the season. Ferrari's struggles continued this year as they only managed 1 pole position in the very last race of the year. They're going to need some big improvements over the next few years, otherwise Leclerc may well struggle to win another championship despite his clear talent. If you're starting to think this is getting a bit boring, don't go anywhere as a major regulation change is about to mix things up quite dramatically in 2027. After another tough season, Perez decided to retire from Formula 1 and was replaced by Alex Albon, who returns to the Red Bull team that he last drove for in 2020. Yuki Tsunoda then moved over to Aston Martin, and a new driver by the name of Felipe Drugovich would bring the nation of Brazil back to F1 as he joined AlphaTauri. Clearly something went very badly wrong in the Red Bull contract negotiations, as reigning 4-time world champion Max Verstappen moved to Alfa Romeo, replacing Zhou Guanyu, who was dropped by the team for the Dutchman. Adding to the madness that Red Bull has become in this off-season, they signed the one and only Nicholas Latifi to their team. One can only assume Red Bull faced some sort of financial problems to lead to this turn of events. The final move in this transfer window was once again the return of who else but Robert Schwartzman back to Alfa Romeo. Maybe just maybe this time he could stay for longer than 1 season. Going to 2027 we had some big driver transfers and some big regulation changes. Surely this would be the recipe for an exciting season. And that is exactly what we got, as Alpine emerged as the dominant force to start out the season. They won the first 13 races of the year as Alonso and Gasly duelled for the championship. However, after the summer break something changed. McLaren and Lando Norris had closed the performance gap to Alpine and proceeded to win 6 consecutive races. Going to the final race of the season, Alonso, Gasly and Norris all had 7 wins each, but due to the early season issues that McLaren had faced, the title fight was only between the 2 Alpine drivers. In the end, there was only 1 point between them after the finale, as it was Fernando Alonso who won the title after a thrilling finale and achieved his 3rd Formula 1 championship a crazy 21 years after his 2nd championship win in 2006. Unsurprisingly, it was Alpine who took the Constructors' Championship with a crazy 891 points. Despite not winning the championship, Norris again proved himself as he had the most wins of any driver come the end of the season with 8 victories. Red Bull faced some problems this year as they only collected 44 points compared to the 567 that they'd collected the previous year. Even AlphaTauri scored more points than Red Bull in 2027. 3 names that were missing from the season were Leclerc, Russell and Verstappen. Leclerc managed 2 pole positions as the team struggled again with pace. Russell didn't really have any highlights from the year as he could only find himself 6th from the Drivers' Championship. Verstappen did achieve 2 pole positions with his new team, but his championship position was even worse than Russell's as he ended up 8th. The regulations would not change going into 2028, but there would be some driver transfers as the 46-year-old and newly crowned 3-time champion Fernando Alonso would retire from Formula 1. He picked up 32 pole positions and 41 race wins throughout his long career. He would be replaced at Alpine by Kevin Magnussen, who joins the reigning champions at in theory quite a good time. Verstappen would only last 1 year at Alfa Romeo before moving to Aston Martin, where he hopes he can find more success than when he was with the Italian squad. Felipe Drugovich would move to replace the Dutchman at Alfa Romeo, whilst Zhou Guanyu would return to F1 with the struggling Red Bull program at AlphaTauri. After a strong end to the previous season, Norris would go into 2028 with high hopes that would be rewarded. He won the first 5 races and won 16 of the first 17. In that time, the only other driver who could beat him was George Russell in Barcelona. After that performance, it is no shock that Norris won his first championship and McLaren joined him as they won the Constructors' Championship. In total, Norris won an incredible 17 races, with the next highest number of wins being Russell on 3. Verstappen got his first win with Aston Martin in Japan, whilst Leclerc would win for the first time since 2024 with a win in Abu Dhabi. The big names of the modern era of F1 really shone towards the end of 2028, so it'd be interesting to see how the final 3 years of the simulation would go. After a tougher season in 2028 compared to 2027, meant that Pierre Gasly decided to retire from Formula 1. Oscar Piastri would move over to Alpine as the Frenchman's replacement, and Yuri Vips would step up to F1 for the Haas team. Again, no new regulations for 2029, so the resurgence of Mercedes and Ferrari at the end of the last season could be continued into this year. Russell would start the season off strongly and would take 9 wins across the season. Leclerc took a while to get back up to speed, but once he did, he was hard to beat as he took 10 wins by the end of the season. The title fight went all the way to the finale as Leclerc and Russell were very close throughout the season. It was Charles Leclerc who took the crucial victory in Abu Dhabi and took his 3rd championship victory as Ferrari won the Constructors' Championship as well. Quite the recovery for Ferrari after several years of struggling. Verstappen and Sainz were the only other winners, as Ferrari and Mercedes seemed to be a step ahead of the competition for most of the season. Sainz took his first victory since 2022, which really highlights the issues Ferrari had had over the previous seasons. The next year would be 2030, and there would be a minor regulation change. However, that would only have an effect on one team, Mercedes. The German team lost a significant amount of performance due to the change, but they would be able to recover quickly. There would be only a couple of driver transfers going into 2028, as champion Lando Norris would retire from Formula 1. He retired with 32 pole positions and 38 race wins, a strong career for the McLaren star. He would be replaced by Formula 2 star Théo Pourchaire. The problems for Mercedes gave Ferrari a head start for the season, as Leclerc won the first 2 races before Mercedes recovered to their winning ways in round 3 with Russell. However, the Mercedes was still not able to consistently take the fight to Ferrari, which allowed the Italian team to take 16 wins across the season. This meant Ferrari easily secured the Constructors' Championship, whilst their driver, Charles Leclerc, won the Drivers' Championship with 14 wins, his 4th championship, which drew him level again with Max Verstappen. George Russell took 5 wins despite the issues his team had over the year. One of his victories was in the final race of the season, so perhaps that was a sign that they can be competitive again next year. Carlos Sainz took 2 more wins, and Alexander Albon took his first career pole position and win in the Belgian Grand Prix for Red Bull Racing. Now we have come to the final season of the simulated career mode, 2031. And if you think this is going to be a quiet end, you are very, very mistaken. A huge regulation change mixed up the performance of most teams, which left many big names scrambling to find where they went wrong. There would be quite a lot of driver transfers for 2031, as after only 1 season, Pourchaire would leave McLaren and move to Alfa Romeo to replace Robert Schwartzman, who was moving to AlphaTauri. Lance Stroll would move from AlphaTauri to McLaren to replace Pourchaire, whilst Nicholas Latifi would retire from Formula 1 and be replaced by Liam Lawson, who would hand over his Williams seat to Jack Aitken. So let's start possibly the most unpredictable season of them all. New McLaren driver Lance Stroll would win round 1 of the season, but it was Aston Martin and Verstappen who would win round 2. They would both take it in turns to win again in races 3 and 4, before 2 more drivers would put themselves into the title fight. George Russell and Charles Leclerc would win round 5 and 6 respectively as their teams began to recover their performance. Verstappen would then win another 3 races, and Russell and Leclerc would get another win each before the middle of the season. At this point in the season, Verstappen had a big championship lead over Russell and Leclerc. However, going into the second half of the season, the order of performance would change as Ferrari took 5 wins in a row, and Leclerc would close up to Verstappen in the championship. Russell would get another win in Singapore, as his consistency also brought him into the title fight. Going into the final 5 races, Leclerc would get another 2 wins to take the lead of the championship, as George Russell and Max Verstappen tried to stay in the fight. Verstappen would win in Brazil, but sadly it was not enough for him to remain in the title fight, as his challenge to become a 5-time world champion would come to an end. Going into the final race of the season, it was Leclerc who led the championship, with Russell still in contention. George Russell would win the final race of the season, but it would not be enough, as heartbreakingly, Charles Leclerc would beat him and become a 5-time Formula 1 world champion. Across the season, Leclerc managed 8 wins, whilst his main rivals Russell and Verstappen got 5 and 6 respectively. The 2 other winners were Stroll and Sainz, with 3 wins between the 2 of them. Something else of note to happen this season was Mick Schumacher and Haas, who would take 2 pole positions, which just adds to the madness that was 2031. Now, that is all 10 seasons completed, with some big surprises and some more predictable elements as well. Here is a graph to show off all the teams that won every race across all 220 of them. You can see here how the teams that had success changed over the 10 seasons. Early on it was Ferrari and Mercedes who were the strongest before Red Bull replaced Ferrari as the top team. Alpine had flashes of brilliance in 2024 and 25 before winning both championships in 2026. However, after that they wouldn't win again. McLaren grew over the first few seasons to become a real front-running team in 2025. They remained fighting for wins until their championship win in 2028, but then they fell off a cliff until 2031, where they took 2 victories. Arguably the retirement of their star driver Lando Norris after 2029 hurt the team's ability to recover to the front. Mercedes were a constant contender as they only went winless in 1 year, compared to their main rivals throughout 10 seasons, Red Bull and Ferrari, who both went winless in 4 seasons. However, this consistency would go without the reward of a single Drivers' Championship and only 2 Constructors' Championships. Aston Martin became a win contender for the final 4 seasons after Verstappen took the team to a higher level, but it wasn't enough to win a championship. Overall, 6 different teams and 10 different drivers took at least 1 victory over the 10 years. There was a lot of driver transfers throughout the 10 seasons, so let's have a look at how the grid ended up in 2031. There was only 5 drivers who remained at their first team by the end of the simulation, with Ferrari the only team to have both their drivers stay to the end. 7 drivers moved teams within Formula 1, and there were 8 new drivers to join Formula 1 from Formula 2. 6 teams had driver lineups without an original driver from 2022, which goes to show how much change there had been over the 10 years. 8 drivers retired during the 10 seasons, and they were Valtteri Bottas at the age of 33, Sebastian Vettel at the age of 36, Lewis Hamilton at the age of 39, Sergio Perez at the age of 36, Fernando Alonso at the age of 46, Pierre Gasly at the age of 32, Lando Norris at the age of 30, and finally Nicholas Latifi at the age of 35. I think it's fair to say that the 2 that stand out there are Alonso retiring at the age of 46 and Lando Norris at the age of 30. 16 years difference in terms of the age at which they retired, but they both retired within a year of each other, so it's not like a certain era of F1 was more likely to have drivers retire at a older or younger age. Now let's look at the best drivers and teams in terms of wins and championships. Firstly, here are the drivers who won over the 10 seasons. Leclerc is at the top with nearly 60 wins, meaning he won 27% of the races. 11 wins behind him is Max Verstappen on 46 victories, with Russell only 5 wins behind the Dutchman, despite not winning a single championship, compared to Verstappen's 3. Then there is Norris, who is the last of the drivers who had a win count in the double digits, as he took 39 wins. Then comes the 2 Spaniards on 9 wins each. However, I must say I think Alonso's are more impressive, as in the one season he had a top car he won the championship, while Sainz watched his teammate win 5 drivers' titles, and he couldn't even win 1. Pierre Gasly took 8 wins, and Lewis Hamilton took 6, which isn't too bad considering his age and retirement relatively early on. Finally, we have Lance Stroll and Alex Albon, who both sort of popped out of nowhere to win races, however neither of them could make a habit of it. Now it's time to look at the teams that won races. Ferrari have the most wins despite their issues midway through the simulation, with Mercedes coming in second with an impressive 47 wins. Only 6 wins behind is McLaren, with Red Bull a further 2 wins back. Red Bull only 4th is perhaps surprising given their championships, but they had a monumental fall-off late on as they began to struggle to even get podiums. Alpine took 17 wins, mainly due to their 1 year of dominance, but they had proved prior to then that they could get the occasional win. Finally, there is Aston Martin, who took 6 wins, all with Verstappen, who pushed the team higher up the grid than they probably belonged. When it comes to championships, it was Leclerc on top, as one of 2 drivers who won multiple championships. Verstappen took 3 titles, whilst Norris and Alonso both won 1 each. Interestingly, Leclerc had a 5-season gap between his second and third championship, which demonstrates how within the 10 seasons, a team can fluctuate their performance quite a lot, which keeps things interesting. Ferrari took the most Constructors' Championships with 4, as Mercedes and McLaren equalled each other on 2. Red Bull and Alpine both had 1 each. I find it intriguing how the Constructors' Championships were spread out much more evenly across the manufacturers compared to the drivers. There were 5 different Constructors' Champions from 2022 to 2027, compared to the 3 different Drivers' Champions across the same years. On 3 occasions, the team that won the Constructors' Championship didn't win the Drivers' Championship in the same season. Now let's look at where these 10 years would place the drivers on the all-time winners list. Lewis Hamilton has the most all-time with 109, with Michael Schumacher in second with 91. Quite familiar so far. Now let's see the big differences, as Max Verstappen has the third most with 66 wins, just 5 ahead of Charles Leclerc on 61. The 2 most successful drivers of the simulation, both up into the top 4 all-time despite neither of them having a huge era of dominance. Now remember that in 2031 they will still only be 35, so their careers may well still have some more time left, so they could get closer to the top with a bit of luck. Next up is Sebastian Vettel and then Alain Prost, so briefly back to normality, before a three-way tie between Ayrton Senna, Fernando Alonso and George Russell. Of course there are many more Grand Prix now, but the fact that George Russell equals 2 3-times champions on victories despite not having a single championship himself is fascinating. Finally taking the 10th position is Lando Norris with his 39 victories and 1 championship. Not bad given the fact that he retired at the age of 30. Next up is the top 10 of all time on the championships won. At the top we have 2 7-time champions of Michael Schumacher and Lewis Hamilton. Then in the tie for third we have Juan Manuel Fangio and Charles Leclerc, the most successful driver of the simulation, both on 5 championships. Next there is a three-way tie for fifth. Alain Prost, Sebastian Vettel and Max Verstappen all have 4 championships. Irrelevant but interesting fact that 2 of these drivers both won all 4 of their championships with Red Bull Racing. Then in 8th there is a 6-way tie of drivers on 3 World Championships. Obviously I could only fit in 3, so I picked the 2 who are highest based on when they won their 3rd title, but also Alonso, as he is of course relevant given that he won his 3rd championship in this simulation. The other 3 in the tie are Niki Lauda, Nelson Piquet and Ayrton Senna. In that 6-way tie, there is champions from every decade since the creation of Formula 1 except one decade. Can you guess which? Brabham won in the 1950s and 60s, Lauda won in the 70s and 80s, Senna won in the 90s, Alonso won in the 2000s, and the 2020s. So only the 2010s didn't have a 3-time champion who won during that decade. Maybe in another timeline Vettel only wins 3 championships at the beginning of the decade, or maybe Rosberg hadn't retired, which could have changed that. In the end, the 3 drivers who won championships in that decade ended their careers as a 1-time, 4-time, and 7-time world champion. So that was the 10 seasons of F1 22 simulated. I thought I would include a few notable things I noticed about the game before the video ends. One particularly positive thing I noticed was that unlike previous games, the AI teams hit maximum performance later, and the regulation change knocks them down a bit further, meaning that it takes longer for them to recover. This is an important improvement over previous games where the teams would max out on performance around Season 5 and 6, and would stay there for the rest of the career mode. However, on the negative side, the Formula 2 drivers that came in to replace the F1 drivers who retired had a very low rating, which didn't seem to improve over the 10 seasons, meaning they weren't really able to achieve anything. Basically wasting seats instead of adding a freshness to the career mode, which is something that I missed. Overall though, I think it was an entertaining experience, and I hope you all found it interesting. But that is it for 10 seasons simulated of F1 22. If you enjoyed the video, then give it a like and comment below any thoughts or questions you may have about the video. We try to regularly produce fun content here with the primary alternative Apex series, What If Porsche Joined F1, having a new episode every other day, and we've produced some other videos that are more like this. The next special will be What If F1 Was a Spec series, so subscribe to the channel if you'd be interested in seeing that. Thank you very much for watching today's video, and I hope you enjoyed it. But that is it for today, so until next time, goodbye.